We're officially 1 week away from the NHL trade deadline, and while there's still a lot of hockey left to be played, things could change dramatically at any point. And with the wild card race being so close this year, I have 8 teams who I think should be the biggest sellers before the deadline is over. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. It's arguably one of the best times of the hockey season, with the trade deadline being less than a week away. Now, with the wildcard race being so competitive this year, there's a couple of teams who should be buying and investing in the remainder of their season, but there's also those who I think should be the biggest sellers. So today we're going to go through 8 teams who I think need to sell off some of their assets before the deadline. And we're going to begin with my top team in the Atlantic Division, which is the Boston Bruins. Hey guys, quick update on this one. There's going to be a couple of players on here who have already been moved, and that's because I recorded this one on Friday, and then right before I posted it yesterday, which was Saturday, both Seth Jones and Ryan Lindgren were traded. So pretty poor timing and luck on my part, but I'm going to keep those sections in this video because I still feel like it's important and it adds to what I was saying here, especially so you guys can see what I thought they were going to command on the trade market versus what they actually got back in return. But before we get back into the video, if you guys are here anyways, why don't you go ahead, hit the like button and subscribe now. I'm sure you'll find more cool hockey content like this on this channel. But either way, let's get back to the video. Thank you guys. The Bruins season has gone a bit off the rails, but more importantly, they lack scoring throughout their lineup. Outside of David Pastrnak, they just don't have a consistent scorer, and their absence of a number 1 center has left this team in a pretty tough spot. In the past, the Bruins have always relied on their strong defense and goaltending to stay competitive. They've never been the flashiest offensive team, but have always had some talent within their forward group. Well, this year, their defense is hurt a lot, with Hampus Lindholm being out the rest of the season, and Charlie McAvoy dealing with that shoulder injury he got from the Four Nations face-off. But even with them in the lineup, it's not like the Bruins were playing any better. They've been about a .500 team all year long and have around a -30 goal differential. So their defense hasn't been great, Jeremy Swayman hasn't been great, and their forward core just can't score this year. So with the Bruins having a bit of a down year and needing some talent with their lack of prospects, I just think this is the perfect time for them to just hit the reset button and try to retool around this core that they've built. Now, here are a few assets that Boston can dish off this season if they want to try and maybe sell at the deadline. The first would be Trent Frederic. He's having a pretty solid year with Boston, and there seems to be a lot of interest for this player. You also have Justin Brazeau, who might not command a lot on the trade market, but could still be a valuable depth piece for a cup contending team. Same goes for Morgan Geekie. Geekie's a bit tricky because he has been playing well with Boston this year, but I just don't know if they're going to be willing to pay him, considering the fact that he's about to have a 30-goal season if he stays at the pace with Pastrnak that he's at. And then last but most importantly, a guy who I think you could get a lot for, Brandon Carlo. He's been pretty good in Boston this year, not exactly the type of guy that will play on your top line, but for a cup contending team, he could be on your second pairing. He's big, he's hard to get around, he's strong defensively, has a good hockey IQ, but for Boston, it just doesn't seem like he's really going to be fitting into the mix anymore. Plus, I think he's signed until the 2026-27 season, so you get some term if you're willing to make that trade, and Boston will be able to get a little bit more back for him. It's a tough spot for Boston. They're still in the mix, so maybe they want to stay competitive. Maybe they just want to keep all of their players and keep moving forward this season. But they don't have any draft picks. They don't have any prospects that they can then retool with in the offseason. So if you can trade off some of these pieces, it might put you in a better position to sign or acquire another player once the season's over. But I think Boston at this point, with the way they're playing, they need to sell some of these assets because I don't think that they're going to be good in the playoffs, even if they somehow get in. Next team on my list, and this is sort of in a somewhat similar position with Boston, and this is the New York Islanders. I think at this point, everybody knows it's time for the Islanders to move on from a lot of their core players. Brock Nelson, Kyle Palmieri, Noah Dobson, Matt Martin, Tony DeAngelo, those are a few names who have been mentioned when it comes to trades. Obviously, a guy like Noah Dobson could get you a lot back with him being an RFA in the offseason, and the fact that last year he had around 80 points on the season, so that's a pretty big plus for you as compared to Boston, who really doesn't have have that kind of trade piece to move off from. You also have Brock Nelson coming off the Four Nations. While it wasn't a great tournament for him, he's still a 30-goal scorer consistently throughout his career. Kyle Palmieri adds some veteran depth for a team if they want to acquire someone. And then other guys like Tony DeAngelo, Matt Martin, who could just be, again, depth pieces for your team. I don't know how much some of those other guys are going to command, but a trade with a guy like Noah Dobson and Brock Nelson could get the Islanders some nice picks or prospects back that could help them maybe build towards the future if they want to. It's a little bit of a tough situation for them. Matt Barzal is consistently injured. Bo Horvat isn't the best guy to have as your top line center, even though he has produced pretty well for the Islanders since joining the team. I just think at this point they need a reset. They're not good offensively. Their defenses look pretty bad. And while their goaltending has had its moments, it's also pretty inconsistent. So the Islanders will likely miss the playoffs this year, and I think they should be selling off of these pieces and not get too excited about the fact that they've won a few games and could squeak in as the 8 seed. You just don't need to do that every year. It's not really getting you anywhere if you're the Islanders. Next up is the Pittsburgh Penguins, and this is probably the most interesting but clear team that should be selling. And the reason they're interesting is because you have a guy like Crosby who clearly doesn't want to leave your organization, and rightfully so. He's earned to decide wherever he wants to play next or if he wants to stay in Pittsburgh. That's totally up to him. But you also have other guys like Evgeny Malkin, Rickard Rakell, as well as Crosby, Letang, and Carlson, who all have no trade clauses. So it's going to be very hard for you to move off of them or get the best market value because they get to decide where they want to play next if they even want to leave Pittsburgh. Then you also have a bunch of contracts that are either limited or modified no trade clauses with guys like Tristan Jarry, who signed to that terrible contract and has been placed on waivers this season, hasn't played much with the show team, the Penguins. So it's a tough situation to be if you're a Penguins fan and even if you're a Penguins GM, because no matter what path you choose, you're going to be the villain. Are you going to be the guy who sells your franchise players off to try and rebuild? Are you going to be the guy who does nothing and leaves the fans out to dry as you go on to another mediocre season? Personally, I think the path is clear. You should be selling off of these guys. You could get so much back for some of these players because, say, a guy like Malkin would be great as a third-line center on a team like Dallas, or a guy like Letang could be great for a team's defensive depth. It's a tough situation to be in. I don't know what or how you're going to be able to do it if you're the GM of the Penguins. I feel bad for Kyle Dubas, but this is the situation you're in, and I personally think the Penguins should be selling. So let me know what you guys think about this team. It's definitely one of the more tricky ones. Next team, we'll keep this short and sweet. I don't know if I've ever seen a sadder video than this one right here of Connor Bedard. We're also seeing all of the drama with Seth Jones and him saying that he wants to leave now. It's the Chicago Blackhawks. And this one is pretty obvious that they should be sellers because clearly nothing is working for them with their current team, and there's not enough talent for them to do anything or build towards anything, really. Ryan Donato is a guy that comes to mind, and of course now Seth Jones. Seth Jones has a terrible contract. It's going to be very hard for Chicago to move him without retaining at least 50% of his salary, but it will be possible with the cap going up and with them not really projected to be a competitive team for at least 3 to 4 more years. I think that this is a pretty easy contract for them to say, hey, we could move off from this and then maybe sign someone else in the future who could help us a little bit more or just continue building through our system. Ryan Donato's had a pretty good year, and while you don't want to sell him off of Connor Bedard because he's been the only good guy for him to play with, I do think his age, turning 29, I think this year, it doesn't really fit the timeline for Bedard, and maybe you could go out and trade him and get a prospect or younger player back to help play with Bedard now. And it might not produce at the same level, but in the future, I think the Blackhawks will be better off if they move off of him. There's also a couple other players that they could potentially move off from, but won't get too much value back for because, again, they're just not a great team right now. But Chicago should easily be sellers. They're way outside of the playoffs and will be a lottery team. So try and move off of these players if you can and continue building around Bedard. But you got to do it properly and potentially sign someone to help him in the offseason because it's getting pretty dark in Chicago. Next team, the Buffalo Sabres, and this one got a little bit interesting because I saw a report saying that they're potentially shopping JJ Peterka now, as well as guys like Dylan Cousins being on the board, Bowen Byram, Jack Quinn. all of these guys who should be good with the Buffalo Sabres, but in typical Sabres fashion, they're just not competing at the high level Buffalo was expecting. I seriously think it's a culture thing in Buffalo at this point because we've seen all of these tremendous players go on to do great things. Jack Eichel, Ryan O'Reilly, Linus Ullmark, just to name a few, Sam Reinhart right off the top of the dome. And I think if you're Buffalo, there's a pretty tough decision to be made here because you don't want to send these players off and have them do the exact same thing as every other star that you moved off from and find success somewhere else. But you also need to do something with this team because the mix of players that you have right now, whether it's a culture thing like we just kind of talked about or just an effort thing, I just don't think this is the right blend of players to really be considered a playoff team anymore. I think Buffalo needs to do something a little bit more drastic. While I do think moving off of Peterka or Cousins is a big move, I think maybe they should be considering dropping a guy like Owen Power onto the trade market to see what he could command back. I think the only guys who should be safe is Tage Thompson and Rasmus Dahlin, and everyone else should be open to at least see what you could get back in exchange for these type of players, because it's crazy that Buffalo's on a 14-year playoff drought and they're not really trying to do anything drastic to fix their issues. So Buffalo should be sellers at the deadline. They're going to miss the playoffs, but be strategic sellers. Don't just move off of players for more picks. Go out and get a player in exchange like you did with the Bowen Byram thing and try to build this team out a little bit more, competitively, and get yourself a better coach next year, because this entire situation just feels like it's unnecessary for Buffalo right now. So they should be sellers. Look for them. They got a couple guys that they could move off from that could get them a pretty high value back. Next team is the Montreal Canadiens, and Montreal's an interesting one because I don't think they should be selling because these players are bad or because they're bad for the mix in the team. I think they should be selling because it makes sense for their rebuild and their trajectory and time frame to get back into the playoffs. These are guys like Jake Evans, Mike Matheson, Joel Armia, and there's another guy that I think they had. David Savard is the other guy I have listed here, where I think these are the type of players that Montreal could get some nice assets back from and potentially move off of them to take a swing on another player who could potentially help them speed up their rebuild and get back into the playoffs. While I do think these guys are nice for the mix of Montreal, I think that guys like Evans are going to command a pretty big contract that won't really fit the timeline of your rebuild. You're not sure if he's going to continue producing at this level, even though he's been solid for you. Same thing with Matheson. You have other guys coming up through your defensive system who will likely take over that spot. And do you really want to be paying him in the future where his age and timeline doesn't really match with some of the other players? It's a bit tricky for Montreal, but I think this is the smart move for them. I do see them making the playoffs over next season or the season after because I think they're finally starting to progress towards that. But the smart move this year, you're probably going to miss playoffs, so sell off of some of these contracts and continue building what you've been doing because it's been working out. Next team is the New York Rangers, and this one might be a little bit odd because you're probably thinking they just traded for JT Miller. Clearly, they're invested in the season and want to compete for a playoff spot. And I don't think that being a seller means that you're going to miss the playoffs. I think it just means you're selling off your pieces to either get assets for a future season or you're trying to get players back in return who might fit this roster a little bit more. You look at guys like Keandre Miller. Rangers fans are completely against him right now, and he hasn't been having the best year. I think he would be a great player for another team, and you could get another guy back. While it might not be the same or equal value, it might be someone who fits your team a little bit better. Riley Smith has had a tough year in New York. Maybe another team would like to grab him. Maybe Vegas wants him back if they feel like he could fit with them a little bit better. Jimmy Vesey, Ryan Lindgren, who signed that one-year contract after being an RFA. He might be a good depth defender that a team is looking for. They all could get you picks, assets, or potentially some other players who might fit this team a little bit better. And I just think that this current blend of players on the New York Rangers isn't going to get them a deep playoff run. I think for the Rangers, you're really looking towards next season and the year after as your window to win a cup. That's where you have all of your players signed. That's where you should be looking to compete. And you shouldn't invest too much in this season. You already got the JT Miller thing. You lost Kaapo Kakko. I think you just kind of have to be smart at this year's deadline and not get suckered into paying all of these guys who are going to be UFAs in the offseason, these contracts, or let them walk for nothing. So that's how I feel about the Rangers. They could still make the playoffs, and they could be a scary team if they do get in, but I don't think that they should be big buyers. I think they should be looking to sell some of their pieces instead. And the last team on my list, and by far the most interesting, is the Vancouver Canucks. But what makes them kind of an interesting one is the fact that they have Quinn Hughes, and he's made it very clear that he doesn't want to go through a rebuild with the Canucks. So the guys who I think they should be trading, it might be a little bit more difficult to trade them with that in mind. But the two players I think they should move off from is Boeser and Pettersson, and those are two of their best players. And just kind of hear me out with this one. They just offered Boeser a 5x8 contract, and it's clear that he wants more term, but they don't want to offer it. I think he's probably looking for more of like an 8x8 contract, which I just don't see the Canucks giving him. So say he gets moved, then what are you going to do with Pettersson? You have him signed to this massive contract where his no move clause kicks in next season, and you're never going to get the same value for him if you do try to trade him, because then he's going to have all of the power. I think if you're going to move off from Pettersson and you don't believe in this player, I think now's the time to do it. But the tricky thing is you can't just trade them for first round picks or assets. You have to get players back, or else you're going to have to move Quinn Hughes, because it's clear that he doesn't want to stay with an organization that's going through another rebuild. And that's a very fair thing for him to say. He's arguably the best defenseman in the NHL, and he's going to be entering his prime, if not already in his prime right now. I think it's a tough situation for the Canucks to say that they're going to be sellers, because no matter what they do in these trades, they're probably going to lose them. But there is a world where maybe they can trade these guys around and get some players who just fit their situation a little bit better. Maybe trade Pettersson to a team like Buffalo, who has a lot of young guys who might be able to fit in and maybe thrive a little bit better in Vancouver. Mikko Rantanen said to be back on the market. Maybe you kick tires on that and see if he would sign an extension in Vancouver. I don't know what the path is going to be, but based on the way they're playing this year as opposed to last year, I just think there's clearly something wrong internally, and I think that at this point they should probably be sellers this year and look to try and build around Quinn Hughes for the future. But let me know what you guys think about these 8 teams. Do you think that these teams should all be sellers? Do you agree with my list? Do you disagree? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's discuss this as well as some other things surrounding the trade deadline this year. Thank you guys as always for watching the channel. Make sure you like this video and subscribe for more content like this. I will see you guys in the next episode.